Welcome and thank you for standing by. Currently, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host for today, Erlene Dowell.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the April Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. Before I introduce today's speaker, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, it will be uploaded to our Census Academy site with all supplemental materials relating to the webinar within 30 business days. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Once you've found the Q&A panel, make sure you choose All Panelists from the drop-down menu. This will ensure we see your question. As time allows, we will answer your questions directly through the Q&A panel, or we will share your questions with the presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, we ask that you do not include any personal or business identifiable information with your questions. We suggest keeping the chat panel open as we will provide key links and other resources throughout the webinar. Keep in mind, we won't be able to respond to the chat. That is for us to send out links and other resources related to the presentation. As you know, we are in a virtual environment and sometimes technical difficulties might occur. If you are having issues, try a different browser or consider logging out and coming back into the session. If you are having audio issues, try selecting the computer audio or calling into the webinar via phone. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information, or LMI Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Ross Evans as he presents Better Metrics Using Wage Records Microdata. In this advanced presentation, the average wages reported by the Census Bureau's Quarterly Workforce Indicators and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, often make it seem like people are earning more than they really are, especially those in regular everyday jobs. A better way to understand what most people actually earn is by using more detailed wage data. When utilizing log transformed methods, this microdata shows clear patterns of what a typical worker earns. Ross Evans is a systems analyst in the LMI department of the Texas Workforce Commission, or TWC, where he has worked since 2001, building databases to support LMI economists. He manages an internal research database of over 1.5 billion Texas wage records dating to 1990 and has contributed Texas data to the longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics program for more than 20 years. He also has participated in the BLS wage record pilot since its inception. A recovering journalist, Mr. Evans began his career at the Washington Star as a copy boy and became deputy national editor before the newspaper's demise in 1981. He moved to Congressional Quarterly, or CQ, as a journalist and later managed development of CQ's online service that pioneered text search technologies long before the internet. He joined TWC after several years at Dell Computer in Austin. With that, I welcome Ross.
Thank you, Arlene. This presentation is presenting a slide deck that I actually developed last year for the LED workshop, which in turn was building on a presentation that I had made 10 years earlier and at an earlier workshop in 2015. At that earlier presentation in 2015, as a baseline, we just demonstrated that wages naturally scale exponentially, not linearly. That log transforming the wage data produces a bell-shaped curve of this distribution. the center mass of that curve and the geometric mean falls significantly below the published QWI average wage statistics. Today, we will try to show what a better metric could be. So first, I'm going to just go into a short primer on what are wage records and what's a wage distribution. The wage records are the administrative records collected by state unemployment insurance departments. They cover almost every job in the country. Some years ago, Census built the LEHD program, which collects this raw data from states and produces from that the quarterly workforce indicators. The slide you're looking at here shows a distribution curve of this data. This is just a representative slide. I've deliberately left a lot of the labeling off it. The wages are across the x-axis on a logarithmic scale. If I didn't do the log transformation, I wouldn't get a nice bell-shaped curve like this. I'd get something more like an L-shaped curve. Because the wages naturally scale exponentially. So a log transformation gives us something that we can work with and that is actually useful. The way these wages are binned, and for each of these vertical bar histogram intervals, is such that each of these intervals, in dollars and cents, the wage value of each interval bar is 10% higher than the bar next to it to its immediate left. Because this universe of wage records is the broadest definition of wages. It includes not only wages, salaries, etc., but also bonuses, etc. And in the raw data, the values range in my database here in Texas, range from 1 cent over on the far left, over on the far right, it can be as high as 10, it's typically in the tens, occasionally in the hundreds of millions of dollars per job. So this is a distribution that shows how many people are making how much money. The blue distribution here of I'm looking at the universe of all private jobs in Texas. Superimposed on that is a subset of that same distribution curve. That blue curve of the universe skews strongly to the left, which you can see easily with the naked eye. And that is due mostly to partial quarter employment in some of these wage records, which is an artifact of the clunky way that unemployment insurance agencies collect this administrative data. The problem is that in the Texas data that we collect, we don't know how long an individual was in each job. We don't know if they're full-time or part-time. We don't know whether they worked one day or whether they worked the full quarter. So a lot of this heavy left skew is really due to people, workers who came or went from a job during the quarter. So those are really partial quarter employment jobs. To screen out those partial quarter jobs, we follow the same practice. I'm following the same practice here that Census LEHD does to produce a set of full quarter jobs, and that's the red subset. These full quarter, to do that, we only select wage records for one SSN in one employer job if and only if that same worker was also in the prior quarter and the succeeding quarter. So they are presumptively employed for the full quarter of this, for the full quarter. That yields a much more well-behaved and somewhat more symmetrical set. There's still a little bit of left skew in that, which is probably due to the fact that this data set includes both part-time and full-time jobs. Now, first, a word about nomenclature. I'm going to be using the word stable in this presentation. And I need to warn you that when I use the word stable, I'm not using it in the same meaning that Census QWI uses the word stable. Census QWI in its website uses the word stable to be essentially a synonym for these full quarter jobs. I can't do that because I'm going to be talking about a mathematical distribution called stable distributions. So I need to reserve that word for what the mathematicians call a stable distribution. But so when I'm talking about stable, that's what I mean. But we're using the same set of full quarter jobs that Census QWI uses. So full quarter is what I'm really dealing with. The plots that I'm going to be demonstrating during this presentation are density plots, which means that the area under the curve is constant because the plot includes exactly 100% of the entire universe being studied here. Now, so now I'm looking again at this distribution of Texas full quarter jobs. This happens to be 2023 Q1. The red histogram bars are the empirical data scaled, as I said before. Each of these histogram bars along the x-axis, the value of the wage is 10% higher than the wage to its left. And these numbers scale all the way from a penny up to, in this case, in the tens of millions of dollars per job. So this is a distribution of how many people make how much. For comparison, I'm showing here as a constant the LEHD QWI monthly wage as published. I've transformed it slightly by multiplying the published number by 3. The data are naturally quarterly. Census divides that by 3 and calls it monthly. So my data is quarterly. So I'm multiplying back by 3 to get an apples to apples comparison. Now, because of the log transform data, as a first order approximation, we can see, okay, what if the wages are not normally distributed, but the logarithms of the wages are normally distributed? And that's what we're looking at here with the green theoretical curve of the normal distribution curve. So basically from the raw data, from the logarithms of the raw data, we compute the standard deviation and the mean of the logarithms. And then when we convert that back to dollars and cents, convert the scale to dollars and cents, that corresponds to the geometric mean of the distribution. That is the green figure here in the plot. Remember, the wages are being read off the horizontal x-axis. So these vertical lines just help us to drop down to the x-axis, and I'm labeling these back in dollars and cents. It is most convenient for me to work under the hood with the logarithms, but I translate back to dollars and cents when I label them. I'm also showing that, as a reference, the median wage of this distribution. And this is as far as I got 10 years ago in the study of these wages. And it looks, just eyeballing this, it looks like, okay, the geometric mean at least gets us into the ballpark here. And the distribution curve is pretty much in the ballpark of what the empirical distribution is. But notice a couple of things. Notice that the empirical data is much more peaky, and it's not a perfect fit along the neckline and shoulders here. And also, you really can't see it here, but the tails of the empirical data are longer than the theoretical green line would show, because when you're going out several distributions, the empirical data has longer tails. What this presentation here is concentrating on is a different formula for the distribution. And I'm using a mathematical set of distributions called stable distributions, which have always existed theoretically, but really have not been practically available to us to calculate until we had the advent of modern computers in the 21st century, really. And we haven't had software to do this, but now we have it. It's just as by analogy, if we're taking, if you were computing the log normal curve from the logarithms of the data here, and I've left that green curve on here from the previous slide as for comparison, you only have to know two things. You have to know the mean and the standard deviation. In a stable distribution, of which the normal Gaussian curve is simply a special case, there are 4 parameters rather than 2. There is an alpha parameter, which indicates the shape, the peakiness, and the length of the tails, etc., the general shape of this distribution. There is a beta parameter, which accommodates skew. There's a gamma parameter that is calculated that is similar to, but not exactly the same as, a standard deviation. And there is a delta that is computed similar to the mean. Deriving this is compute intensive for large data sets, especially. And until we had modern software, we couldn't do it at all, really. So the hard part is deriving the 4 parameters. From those 4 parameters, we plug that back in, analogously back into the stable software, and produces the black line here, this curve, that actually is a much better fit for the empirical data. Notice that it is closer to the peak, that it is a closer fit along the necklines and the shoulders, and also it's a closer fit on the tails. It is still not perfect. If you go out and look at first, you can notice to the naked eye here that the empirical data is still slightly peakier than even this model shows. And if you go out to the tails, don't have a slide on this, but I tested it to see how well these long tails fit the theoretical stable distribution. And they fit all the way out to the basically close to the bottom 1% and the top 1%, in which case the tails are still longer than the Gaussian curve would predict, but they are not as long as the theoretical stable distribution curve is. But there we're dealing only with the top 1% and the bottom 1%. And that's really not the part of the curve that I'm interested in here. I'm interested in really the center. I'm trying to find what is the best optimal metric to use as a measure of central tendency to describe what workers are actually making. And the way to do that is to compute that curve. And here we have the advantage of having an equation that is smooth, that fits that curve as closely as possible. From that equation, we can compute the mode, which is the zenith of that curve, which is basically the best measure of the mode of that empirical distribution. That mode is what I would label a typical wage. It is the mode of the log stable distribution. Now, why the mode? Notice the mode and the median are fairly close. Now I would make this statement about the mode, is that not only is the mode the place where the greatest concentration of jobs falls, but it's not just in this case, it also represents a real world phenomenon in the labor market. Because this is not a data set of 10 million dice throws. These represent real jobs in the real economy, dynamically changing all the time. So now just imagine, for example, that you are a worker and you're somewhere on the left side of this curve. And you're wondering, what do I have to do to get that 10% raise? You might adopt various strategies. You might try to get promoted. You might change jobs. You might change careers. You might go back to school, etc. But the good news for you is that you're on one of these histogram bars. The good news for you is that there are more jobs on the histogram bar to your right, making 10% more than the rung of the economy that you are already occupying. So if you play your cards right here, given turnover, experience, etc., you stand a pretty good chance of bettering your situation. But sooner or later, there's a turning point here. And from that point on, after the peak, things get harder and harder. And so it becomes progressively much more difficult to make that jump. But the point is that the mode here represents a real thing in the real economy. Remember the Peter principle from, there was a bestseller from circa 1970 that says that we all ultimately grow to reach our level of incompetence. Basically, the real economy, the real labor market is sorting itself into this curve. Now, so I proposed as a measure of the typical wage, the mode of that curve. And here, for instance, it is 74% higher than what we are publishing in QWI. And in percentile terms, it would fall around the 72nd percentile. Now, over time, over the past few years, for example, if I adopt my typical wage as the horizontal red line as my benchmark, here's the way the QWI indicators vary. And they're all above the benchmark, above that benchmark, because they just intrinsically are. And there's a big seasonal factor here in Q1 of each year because of bonuses. There is a very strong seasonal pattern of bonuses in the real economy, which tend to show up in Q1, and bonuses tend to be heavily concentrated on the right side of that bell curve. Now, how does this change over time? Here is an example of what that curve looks like if we animate it quarter by quarter over 23 years. You'll notice You can see the seasonal patterns. There are cyclical patterns, and there are secular changes here. As this curve sort of crab walks from left to right across the x-axis, that's wage inflation. So if you look here, if we looked at, say, what was the typical wage measured at the peak of that curve, in 2020 Q1 was $6,800. By 2023, that had inflated to 13,500. Ditto if we looked at Q2, comparing Q2 to Q2, that also increased over time. Now, there's also an alternate way that we might use the microdata, and that is, instead of just aggregating this data per job, we can also look at it per person, because in the real world, people work multiple jobs. People change jobs all the time. Remember all that heavy left skew that we saw in the blue part of the curve on one of my first slides there? Turns out that much of that skew was just the same people changing jobs during the quarter. And so much of that problem goes away if we aggregate per person. If you aggregate per person, that also picks up moonlighting jobs, as well as jobs during the quarter or multiple part-time jobs, because the economy is complicated. Now here in this, I used a slightly different data set here, not just private employment, but also state and local government employment, to be as broad as possible in the data set I have to work with. Because the same worker, for example, a public school teacher might moonlight as a consultant or as a cashier or whatever. Now, and I also limited this to full quarter jobs, but in this case, full quarter jobs, the only records that I'm eliminating are those who were not in the Texas labor market at all during the quarter. So I'm not discarding as many records. The per worker view here is more comparable to some other data sets, such as income in the survey-based CPS for households. But once we do that, once we aggregate by per worker instead of just per job, we can apply the same methodology to that. When I do that here, I can calculate a typical wage of per worker instead of per job. And the data set here is larger because it also includes state and local employment. So by this analysis, the QWI published average wage is more representative of high earning employees. The typical wage that I'm computing would be a much better fit for most rank and file jobs. Now, the QWI published numbers aligns fairly closely with the BLS QCEW average weekly wage. But I suggest that both of these are somewhat wrong-headed because they both share the same flaw. They are both estimating the arithmetic mean of a variable, that is wages, that does not scale arithmetically. Now, BLS has sort of a bureaucratic alibi for that because they do not have in QCW the wage record microdata. But Census does have it and does publish this information product, QWI, yet when it comes to computing the wage value that is published, it makes essentially the same, they share the same flaw, because it just computes the simple arithmetic mean of the wage data, when it would be, we can do better because we've got all the microdata. Now, the log stable map model that I've described here is in fact compute intensive and it's not easy to do. So the software options are limited. There are trade-offs between resources and accuracy. So I recognize that it may be hard to implement this in a production workflow at QWI, where it's nationwide data and it's also sliced and diced in a lot of per industry, per geographic locale, etc. So it might not be feasible to implement what I'm suggesting in production. And even if you don't buy into this methodology of using stable software to compute the mode, a fallback to that would be just a good old-fashioned median, which is much more easily computable. It's much closer here to the center mass of the distribution. In fact, the median is even a little bit lower than the typical wage, and the reason for that is because of the way that part-time jobs, I think, affect this. I think the mode is slightly more affected by the part-time, by the inclusion of part-time wage records. But we've really corrected for that, and Census has already corrected for the full quarter jobs. There would be a good argument for not publishing a median for the raw data because of that huge artificial left skew from partial quarter jobs. But since Census has excluded those partial quarter jobs from the subset of full quarter jobs, we've essentially we've corrected for that already. So a median wage would be more easily computable. There are, in this distribution, there's some links here to some sources about, if you want to learn more about about stable distributions. My contact information is here on the final slide. I know that Census is going to archive this presentation, but they do it in a PDF form. The problem with storing it in PDF form is that it clobbers that animated slide that I did. So if you want the presentation in PowerPoint mode, which preserves the animation, just email me and I would be glad to send you a copy. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross. Before we get to the questions, as a reminder, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab within 30 days. The link has been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees. So let's give it a second for people to ask questions. We have a thank you for this immense knowledge. Give it another minute or so.
Yeah, I apologize if it got a little wonky, but
Well, we saw some applauses, and we kept our audience, so this is definitely very high level, and so that just means our audience is high level.
Yes. Okay, here's our first question. How does the mode look for men and women compared to BLS and Census if you did that calculations?
well, I can't answer that question because I don't know, because I don't in my data, I don't have that demographic. I'm using my raw data as collected here in Texas. Once the the demographics that are present in the census QWI is done by value-added processing that Census is doing on their end within the LEHD program.
Hi, Ross. This is fascinating. What software did you use? I hear you say stable software.
Well, can you see my screen to the here showing the citations? Is that still visible?
Yes, it's still visible on our site. Correct.
Okay. Well, probably the academic guru for stable distributions is a Professor John Nolan at American University. I think he's just gone emeritus, and he's probably the principal academic authority here, and he did the breakthrough work on writing the software that is able to compute the 4 parameters of stable distributions, etc. And then if you follow links to his work, you can find his software. I didn't use his software for efficiency reasons. Actually, I used a sort of a follow-on software, this library in R called libstable, because it's more efficient using parallel processing. But all of my computational work is done mostly in R. My database is up of the raw data is upstream in SQL Server. And so the process basically selects the set of data out of SQL Server, transforms it into a logarithm, sucks it into the libstable software, produces the 4 parameters, and then I capture the 4 parameters. It is compute intensive. I mean, for example, to do my full universe of, I mean, if I've got 16 million private, well, if I look at just private, I'm looking at only 9, 10 million, I guess. I mean, the process to compute that for me using a fairly beefy Windows laptop is for 1 quarter's worth of data, it might run a couple of hours. But if I'm doing a lot of, so I have to sort of make a trade-off between runtime and accuracy. So the best way that I found to do that is to make basically sample my 10 million records down to like 100,000, which makes it more feasible to do that. So I really do that as I do the sampling in R. I just suck all the data down into R using and then my R script produces the sample, submits that to the functions in the libstable library, and then that produces the results.
Hey, a follow-up question is, and you may have answered this already, is this different from SAS R?
I don't think SAS will do this for you. I'm not really a SAS user. When I last looked at this, SAS, if SAS now can use R libraries, maybe you could maybe you could call this library into R, but I don't know. I know that native SAS cannot really do a stable distribution calculation. But if it can incorporate, if it can basically host R, it might be that R could host the stable libraries to actually do the grunt work.
Do you have to use a log stable distribution for the mode to be considered a typical wage, or can the log normal distribution be used for this as well?
Well, if I can, the log normal, which is what the log normal is what I did. Are you seeing me scroll back in my slides here? I can compute the geometric mean using without fooling with any of the stable distributions. If I just look at the log normal, I can compute the geometric mean. But I think it is more representative to use the log stable mode because it is a better fit to the whole empirical curve of data.
Thank you. That ends our Q&A session. I will turn the mic back over to the host, Erling Dell.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to Ross for this extremely high-level presentation. Ross, would you like to make any closing remarks?
No, not really. I'm just hoping that someone who has access to all of this data can adopt some of these methodologies, even if it's just falling back to the median, so that we might, because the thing that worries me most when I set aside all of the wonky math is that the numbers that we're publishing, both at BLS and at Census, grossly overstate what typical workers are actually making. So that's really my bottom line plea is let's publish a better metric using somehow by one of these methods using the microdata.
All right, well, this concludes the April LED webinar. Join us next month when Aja Suljic presents Wage Records Demonstration Project, Multi-State Workforce Inflow and Outflow. Upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you with future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.